Tonight, our topic's going to be creation versus evolution as we continue to dig for answers. Now again, for those of you that weren't here last night, I want you to be aware the bulk of this material does come from the Apologetics Press Teen and Adult Manual, although I've added some things to it, try and make it pertinent and beneficial for you all. So I hope you worked on your memory verses last night, or at least marked them in your Bible. I have two more for you as promised. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The next is 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 39. This is a very interesting passage we're going to look at tonight that's really going to disprove evolution in and of itself. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. So again, if you have issues memorizing things, at least mark them down in your Bible. Well, the first thing we want to start off with is some definitions. We've already introduced evolution and creation. We need to define what we mean when we use these terms. Now the first is evolution. Now the evolution we are going to be talking about tonight is called atheistic evolution, or it's sometimes referred to as organic evolution. And it is defined as a scientific theory that claims that the universe is self-contained, that everything in the universe has come about through random processes over long periods of time without any outside cause, that is, a creator. Now, according to evolution, no supernatural being had any part in the origin or the development of life, so they deny the supernatural. Evolution also claims that all living things originated from one original organism that was single-celled, and it arose from something that was not living. In other words, spontaneous generation. Now, evolution also states that all things originate through natural processes and that nothing outside of nature exists. But let's spend a little bit of time talking about a theory, because sometimes we get the idea in our head that a theory is just, well, I think maybe kind of sort of this might work. But to a scientist, that's not how they define a theory. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as a plausible or scientifically acceptable general principle or body of principles offered to explain things or phenomena. Now, I'm also going to read to you from their dictionary page for the word theory. So not only do they define things on their website, they also have comments about them. And this comes from Kenneth R. Miller. If you do not know who he is, he's a cell biologist at Brown University. He's a very outspoken individual. I found his name several times as I've done research. He said, a theory does not mean a hunch or a guess. A theory is a system of explanations that ties together a whole bunch of facts. Right away, what are they establishing their theory upon? Facts. They say they have facts. They're tying them all together into a theory. He says it not only explains those facts, but predicts what you ought to find from other observations and experiments. So you should be able to test these things and get similar type results. Now, while theories are never completely infallible, they form the basis of scientific reasoning because, as Miller said, to the best of our ability, we've tested them, and they've held up. Did you catch that? They've tested them. Evolution is a theory. Supposedly, they've been able to test it. I'd like to see those results. Let's look at Charles Darwin. The reason you've seen so many pictures of him on here is because he's sometimes termed the father of evolution. Now, he didn't come up with all this stuff on his own. He had many influences in his life. But he wrote a book called The Origin of the Species. How many of you have heard of that book before? Yeah, it's a pretty famous book, primarily on natural selection. But he actually covers difficulties on the theory in one chapter. He dedicates a whole chapter to this. And I want to quote from his book. He says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find out no such case. No doubt many organs exist of which we do not know the transitional grades, more especially if we look to much isolated species, round which, according to my theory, there has been much extinction. What is Darwin saying with this statement? He's basically saying, because I haven't been able to find these things, and they probably don't exist, they've maybe been destroyed or extinct, well, I don't see any reason this couldn't happen. Where's the facts? Where's the proof? I have this little guy. You remember him? What's his name? Yeah, the bombardier beetle. I'd like to see Darwin explain him. You think about what we looked at last night, all the different systems in him, the organs that he has. Very complicated. We think about the eye. In fact, he talks about the eye in that. And he wants to reduce the eye to a single nerve that's just sensitive to light. And then he says over enough time, we get the complex eye that we have. And you remember all the different things we talked about the eye, how complex it was, how it integrated with the brain. He says that can happen given enough time. And time is the key element in all of this. If you do not have a lot of time, evolution breaks down. And as we get to Thursday, we're going to show they don't have time. There is evidence to show they don't have millions and billions of years that they hope they have. So what is creation? Now, one thing we need to understand, creation, evolution, they're exact opposites. They are opposed to one another, they're on opposite sides of the spectrum. According to creation, the universe is not self-contained. A supernatural being is responsible for the origin and the design of the universe. And this being used processes that are not still in operation today. He used them to construct all things, including the various forms of life that we have, the animal life, the plant life, the human life. Now, which of these two views is correct? They cannot both be correct. If you have two things on the opposite end of the spectrum, they are opposed to one another, they contradict one another. Logically, they both cannot be right. They can both be wrong, but they both cannot be right. There's no room in evolution for a supernatural being. And creation has no room for a purely natural process in which some single-celled organism, gradually given enough time, evolved into everything that you see today. They are at odds with one another, they are opposite, they are opposed, and they are contradictory. So the evidence that we have, the facts that we have, point us to one of these two views. Let's look at the law of cause and effect. I even got some animation for you. How many of you know what that is? Seen one of those before? That's Newton's cradle. And it illustrates so well the law of cause and effect. And as far as science knows, natural laws, and we're talking laws now, have no exceptions. And this is certainly true of the law of cause and effect, the most universal and the most certain of all the laws. Now, simply put, the law of cause and effect states that every material, and underline that word, material effect, must have an adequate cause that also existed before the effect. So there's several things going on in this law. Now, when we use the word material, what we mean is anything that's composed of matter and energy, and that's what you're going to find on the earth. Here's some truths of the law of cause and effect. Material effects without adequate causes do not exist. Causes never occur after the effect. The effect must take place after the cause. The effect is also never greater than the cause, so there must be a cause that is much bigger than the effect seen. And that is exactly why scientists say that every material effect must have an adequate cause, not just a cause, but an adequate cause. To illustrate that, a river does not turn muddy because a frog jumps in it. A book does not fall off the table because a fly landed on it. These are not adequate causes to explain that behavior. Whatever effects we see in the universe, everything that we have here is an effect. We have to have an adequate cause for that. Now let's illustrate this as well, and you may have experienced this for those of you that have children. They say, "Mommy, where do peaches come from?" And what's our answer? Well, they come from peach trees. Well, where do peach trees come from? Well, they come from peaches, more specifically the seed. Well, eventually they want to figure out, well, where did the first one come from? What are they demonstrating here? The law of cause and effect. They see the effect, they want to know the cause. Well, one thing is certain, the universe did not create itself. There are other laws, the law of conservation of mass. Matter cannot create matter, it can just be changed into something else. If we take a rock that weighs 1 pound, we do 5,000 experiments on it, you know what we're going to get at the end? 1 pound of rock. Now, it may not look exactly the same, but you're going to get the same amount of matter. So whatever caused the universe could not have been material. So what did cause the universe? Well, guess what? We have a book that tells us the answer, and it is the Bible. The very first book, with the very first chapter, the very first verse tells us, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Right away, the Bible introduces what? Creation. It introduces God, it introduces creation. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 24, Luke records, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that He is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Exodus 20 and verse 11, Moses records there, For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Why is this continually repeated in the Bible, do you suppose? What is God, the Holy Spirit, trying to impress upon us? He is the Creator. We didn't just come about by chance. He's also undoubtedly an adequate cause. Remember, we have to have an adequate cause. What is one of the properties of God? He's all-powerful. We call that almighty as well. Omnipotent. Genesis 17 and verse 1, He told Abraham, I am the Almighty God. Now Job, in Job chapter 33 and verse 4, he stated it this way, The Spirit of God hath made me, and the breath of the Almighty hath given me life. Now remember, the cause also has to come before the effect. Well, God fits that as well. Psalm 90 and verse 2, Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting thou art God. So He was here before we were, before the universe was. So what do we see lining up here? He's all-powerful. He's an adequate cause. He happens before the effect. Something else God is as well. He's moral. What are morals? Say again? Well, what is morals, though? Those things that must present the good and the bad, good and evil. From whence do we get these ideas from? From God. He is a God of morals. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18 states that it is impossible for God to lie. It says that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie. What does lying naturally imply? Sin in opposition to the truth. Lying is deception. So He is a moral God. And as such, we have an obligation as human beings to be holy, to live holy, because He is holy. 1 Peter 1, verses 15 and 16, Peter writes, But as He which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy, in all manner of conversation, because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy. And that goes clear back to the Pentateuch. The children of Israel were to be holy because God was holy. We see that only God fits the criteria of an adequate cause that came before the universe. So here's a question that naturally might come up. If we contend that every material effect must have a cause, and we say that only God could have caused the universe, so have you ever heard this question? What caused God? Well, that's a fair question. Doesn't the law of cause and effect apply to God? What do you think? Well, in a word, it doesn't. And here's why. There's a single word, remember that one I told you to underline in the law of cause and effect? Material. Every material effect must have a cause that existed before it. What is God? He's a spirit. John chapter 4 and verse 24, God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. Scientists took what they could see, what they could test, the material things, and from it they discovered the law of cause and effect. How many science experiments can we do on God? You put God in a beaker and measure Him? You can't. He's a spirit. Let's conclude this. Science is certainly far from learning everything about this material world, but it's also farther away from understanding the eternal nature of God. In fact, that's even hard for us to fathom. Eternity, even though we read about it in the Bible. We know there had to be a first cause for everything that we see, and God was and is the only one that is suitable for this job because He is self-existed. He's always existed, and He always will exist. That's what eternal is. The law of cause and effect is a scientifically established law that does not have any known exceptions, and that's important for us to understand. We don't need somebody coming and saying, well, what if? This is a law. The evidence is sufficient to show that the material universe needs a non-material cause, and that non-material cause is God. Now, if we think about it, if natural forces created the universe and all that is in it, randomly selecting themselves, you have a serious problem explaining morality. From whence do we get morals if you take God out of the equation? So let's use the cause or the law of cause and effect here. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1 says, in the beginning, cause before the effect, God Almighty, so there He has the power, created the heaven and the earth. John 1 verses 1 through 3. I always find this passage so interesting because we learn that it's Jesus that was the creator. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Again, you skip down, you find out the Word was made flesh. That's Jesus Christ. Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 6, Thou, even Thou art Lord alone, Thou hast made heaven, the heaven of heavens with all their hosts, the earth, and all things that are therein, the seas and all that is therein, and Thou preservest them all, and the host of heaven worshipeth Thee. Did God leave His creation alone after He created it? He's preserving it still to this day. Well, let's also look at the law of biogenesis. Now, don't get too scared about these terms. We will define them. Now, in biology, one of the most widely used laws of science is the law of biogenesis. Now, simply defined, bio means life. Genesis means beginning. So when you combine these, it deals with the beginning of life. It simply states that life comes only from previous life of its own kind. Now, why is that important? What does that refute in evolution? Spontaneous generation. That life came from something non-living. Now, we see this law played out every day. How many of you have pets? How many of you have had pets that gave birth to animals? Now, you may have had a dog or a cat. Did it give birth to a cow or a fish or a turtle? No, it gives birth, if it's a dog, to a puppy. Cat, kittens. We understand that. This little chick right here understands it. Why is this chicken sitting on a dog and not their babies? Over the years, the truthfulness of this law has been documented by thousands of scientists. One of the most famous of those is Louis Pasteur. How many of you have heard of Louis before? Yeah, what's he famous for? Pasteurization, exactly right. And his work, a very simple experiment, dealt a crushing blow to the idea of spontaneous generation. Again, that life arises on its own from non-living sources. So here's what his experiment was. I know in the back this may be hard to see, so I will describe it for you. He took a jar here, or a flask. He filled that with a nutritive soup, so a type of soup, something that bacteria would love to get into and multiply and grow. But what he did was he bent this flask to the point where bacteria, if they came in from the air, would get stuck in that bend. And then he sterilized it. He heated it up. He killed the bacteria. He let that sit for a number of time. And you know what he found out? Nothing grew in it. Nothing grew in that flask. So he did the same thing, but this time he broke off that S shape of the flask. So now what can get inside there? Air. And you know what rides on air particles? Bacteria. So what did the bacteria do once it got in there? Started reproducing. He found bacteria. Well, he did the same thing with the S-shaped flask, but this time, instead of breaking it, he bent it over, so he defeated the purpose of that bend. The bacteria could then work its way up through there, and guess what? Bacteria was present again. You can still try this today if you want. It is still just as applicable. Now, in earlier centuries, people thought that life arose from non-living things. There are people that actually believed that you could take some wheat grains, wrap them in an old rag, stuff them in the corner of a barn, and you can get mice out of it. Well, why did the mice really come there? They wanted to eat. They weren't created from it. They said, ooh, wheat, I'm going to eat that. Now, teachers and professors, they point out, Louis Pasteur, they can't deny it. It's scientific fact. You can do it yourself. And they say this is a mythology, spontaneous generation. But then what do they do in the same breath? They say evolution occurred as a result of spontaneous generation. What did they just do? They contradicted themselves. If it sounds like hypocrisy, it's because it is. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron. Does that describe abundance of evolutionists today? I think so. Hypocrisy is certainly something we must face as Christians, and we especially are going to have to combat it with our children because they're not being taught intelligent design in the schools. They're being taught evolution. But thankfully, not only do we have the Word of God on our side, we have true science. And we certainly thank Louis for his experiment. Well, let's wrap this up. The fact of the matter is that evolution could not have occurred without some form of spontaneous generation. And for this reason, many scientists have tried to use experiments and other things to bring something non-living and to create life from it. And we're going to look at some of these tomorrow night. After all of these attempts, you know how much life they've been able to create from non-living substances? Goose egg. 0. They haven't been able to do it. Now think about this. If thousands of scientists have designed carefully planned experiments to create life from something that is non-living, and they failed miserably every single time, how can we possibly be expected to believe that nature just happened to do this on its own? Just random things happening, just by chance. Well, on the contrary, whether in nature or in the laboratory, scientists have never documented a single case of spontaneous generation. You know what? They're never going to be able to either. Life comes only from previous life of its own. And you know what? Creation, the account of it, teaches us this. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, notice what the record says. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply. Law of biogenesis. After their own kind, reproducing after their own kind. Fill the waters and the seas, let fowl multiply in the earth. Now verse 24 and 25, And God said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind. Do you notice a repeating theme here? And cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. What is God trying to impress upon mankind? The law of biogenesis. These creatures are created after their kind. Well, we know that was how it started, but we also know there was a global flood. The earth was changed. A lot of organisms perished in that flood. But notice what took place after that. Genesis chapter 6, verses 17 through 20. This is actually in preparation for it. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, God speaking to Noah, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. they shall be male and female. Why male and female? Wait a second. I thought we could have homosexuals and everything's okay. Can you reproduce that way? I think not. Of fowls, here it comes, after their kind. And of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind. Two of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. Why was God doing this? He understood, well, I can't just bring a turtle and a bird and then create all the organisms I need on the earth. They have to be after their own kind. And I have to have male and female so they can reproduce and bring forth after their kind. It makes sense, doesn't it? We see it. Well, let's also look at the fossil record. Is there evidence for creation here or evolution? Now, without looking at this point just yet, what does evolution say about the fossil record? What does it set forth as? A proof for evolution or something that denies it? What do you think? Ever heard of a dinosaur before? What are dinosaurs used for in evolution? You guys are quiet tonight. You need some cookies. That's coming up in about 5 minutes here. Dinosaurs are the poster child for evolution. We're going to spend a whole night Wednesday talking about that. How old are the dinosaurs? What does evolution tell you? Yeah, 60 million, maybe billions of years old. And where do they get that information from? Fossils. Are there any living dinosaurs today, like what we see in the fossil record? They're huge creatures, massive creatures, and yet they say here, aha, we have proof for evolution. But is that really what the fossil record shows? Fossils simply are the remains of once living organisms. They can be plants, they can be animals, they can be humans that were buried in rock or turned into rock in the earth. And these are found all over the globe. Now, why is that significant, do you think? Yeah, the flood, and we're going to get to that. And these fossils are useful. They're good things to have because they give us insight into the past. We can't go back, like in the time machine, and check out how life was in the past unless we have historical evidence. Those fossils provide some of that history. So if any physical evidence exists to establish evolution, certainly it must come from the fossil record. But does it? So in order to establish evolution, its supporters must show that the fossil record contains transitional forms of plants, animals, and humans. After all, if something started from a single-cell organism and came into all of the complexity that we have now, you have to have some way to get from point A to point B. And there's got to be a lot of things in that line over a lot of period of time. So you would think the fossil record, if evolution is true, would have that. Now, when I talk about a transitional form, I'm talking about an organism that exhibits characteristics of two separate groups. Kind of like this guy right here, half reptile, half mammal. Well, this is just a guy in a costume. You laugh, but you think about it. Evolution kind of on the same plane, isn't it? Even Charles Darwin, who is often referred to as the father of evolution, claimed that the fossil record should show innumerable, you shouldn't even be able to count them all, of the transitional links. Now here's something you may have not known about Charles Darwin. He was actually trained by geologists. Charles Lyell, you may have heard that name, you may have not, but he was a geologist that Darwin actually set at his feet in the university. And Lyell is one of the fellows that came up with this, the earth must be billions of years old. So Darwin got the idea of this massive time frame from him, and he said, aha, I'll come up with a theory that fits all of biology into that. Hence, natural selection is born. The book that he has, Origin of the Species, Evolution. So I found that so interesting because Darwin really is a geologist. Now, a geologist is the one that studies rocks. He titled the 10th chapter of his book, Origin of the Species, on the imperfection of the geological record. That's the title. And you can go out. This is a book you can freely download on the internet and read it. Just read it like it's fiction, because that's what it is. And he thought that a number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. And I quote, "Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record." What is Darwin saying here? He's saying, I can't find the transitional forms in the geological record. Something's wrong with the geological record. Where does the imperfection actually lie? Is it in the geological record, or is it in the theory? Now, Darwin's time, 150 years have passed, and you know what we've been able to find in those 150 years? More fossils. In fact, we've found millions of them. But guess what we haven't been able to find? Transitional forms. We haven't been able to find them in the fossil record. Now, on occasion, some scientists produce alleged, underline that word, transitional forms, such as Piltdown Man, and we'll talk about him tomorrow night, and Archaeopteryx. He's over here. Have you heard of Archaeopteryx before? He is supposedly the dinosaur bird transitional form. Of course, we purport he's really just a bird. Furthermore, on occasion, these things prove to be frauds. They're not true. And not one of them has ever been proven to be an authentic transitional form. Again, we're going to look at some of those tomorrow night. The fact of the matter is, the fossil record still lacks the multitude of these transitional forms that Darwin says must be there. They have to be there if evolution is true. Well, why is it? Why aren't those transitional forms there? Because the theory is false. There are no transitional forms. And as we gain technology and we excavate more of these fossils, we're only going to find more evidence toward creation. Here's a reality check. What does the fossil record show? Whenever we approach something, we're trying to learn about it, we need to ask the question of not what do I think it shows, what does it show? Look at the data first. Oh, it shows millions of organisms, yes, but suddenly arriving on the scene and they're fully formed. They're complex creatures. In fact, if you go down to the very lower layers of the earth, where you have the plant life, the crustaceans, the others, they've actually found in these fossils eyes that are more complex than eyes that we have today in organisms. Complex eyes that are more complex than what we have today in insects and other things. How does evolution answer that? What model of origins could account for the sudden appearance of fully functional living organisms? Creation or evolution? Which one? Creation. God designed it. We're going to look at polystrate fossils. Now, how many of you know what a polystrate fossil is? You ever heard that term? Got one in the back. One of the most impressive arguments for an ancient Earth is the testimony of sedimentary rock layers. How many of you have heard about the Grand Canyon before? How many have had the pleasure to actually go there? I'd like to at some point. It's massive in size, isn't it? What is the Grand Canyon famous for, besides being beautiful? All those different rock layers, right? And what do the tour guides and the scientists tell you about all those rock layers? Yeah, they're laid down in epochs of time, slowly accumulating, creatures slowly evolving over time, becoming fossils trapped in there. They'll give you examples like that, and they present their theory so effectively that as we observe those layers, that we think in our minds, well, there had to have been an abundance of time involved with this. Each division of the rocks, we are told, represent a time long ago in the ancient world that long since has ceased to exist. But we as creationists beg to differ with this explanation. We suggest that a closer look at the record of the rocks actually shows the youth and not the antiquity of the rocks. How many of you remember the eruption of Mount St. Helens? Now, if you go there and you look at what took place there, what does it look like? Have you seen pictures of what it looks like? It's just a massive canyon. There's a floating log mat on the lake there. There's portions that have just been carved away by this massive explosion. You would think, well, if I didn't know Mount St. Helens erupted, this looks like it might have happened over a long period of time. You remember when that took place? Yeah, 1980. How many years has that been? Just a few years, right? And yet if you went there and you didn't have that knowledge, you would think this took a lot of time, right? Because it looks similar to other things, a miniature version, we might say. But that's not the case, is it? It happened very quickly. Oh, think about this. In fact, there is a wonderful documentary out there called Is Genesis History? How many of you have heard about it or perhaps seen it? It is a wonderful documentary. And it gives some excellent evidence toward the flood and support for creation. I'll give you a clue. You might just be getting a copy of it later on this week for your library. I want you all to be able to take that home and to look at it and really learn about it, because it was eye-opening to see how these things, and it just fits. And we can see it with these fossils as well. Now, embedded in sedimentary rocks all over the globe are what are known as polystrate fossils. Now, that word polystrate simply means many layers. So these are fossils that aren't horizontal, they're vertical, and they intersect at least two of these sedimentary rock layers. Now, why is that important? What are we told about these sedimentary rock layers? Yeah, there's a lot of time in between laying them down. So if we have vertical fossils, that means that thing must have been slowly being covered up over millions and billions of years. But wait a second. What is this that we have right here? What do you think that looks like? A tree. Well, what happens to trees if we just leave them out in nature? And they're not rooted down, they're just cut down, they're just left out there? They rot. They rot. They're not turned into fossils. They decay and they go back and they create wonderful mulch and life for other creatures and things that they need. Probably the most widely recognized of the polystrate fossils are tree trunks, and it's not just one that we find. We find multiple of these type of fossils, and it's not just trees either. But they extend vertically through 2, 3, or more sections of rock that, again, we're led to believe by evolution occurred over millions of years. But we know organic materials such as wood that's exposed to the various elements of the earth and the atmosphere aren't going to fossilize, they're going to rot. So it must be that the entire length of the tree trunk, to be preserved quickly, had to have been deposited in these rock layers rapidly. Well, what's something that you can think of that happened a long time ago that may have caused that? Yeah, how about a global flood? Would that allow sediment to be deposited rapidly over a large period of the earth? Or a large section of the earth? Absolutely. In fact, we have one trunk that is a tree in a sandstone quarry near Edinburgh, Scotland. This thing's 82 feet long, and it actually intersects 10 to 12 different strata. So that's different layers in the rock. This thing intersects them. And it's there at an angle of 40 degrees. So this thing must have been falling as it was buried and stacked up. 10 to 12 layers on that tree. How do we explain that with evolution? Polystrate fossils are also very common in coal formation. Now, it's interesting to think about coal. We think, well, we're led to believe that coal takes a long time to form. You know what? Scientists have been able to form coal with the right conditions in a couple weeks. Go out and read about it. In fact, that's in this Genesis History documentary, I believe. But we're led to believe it takes a long time to make rocks. You know, they can make rocks in a few days. a few days you can make a rock. Let's conclude the fossil record and then I'll cut you loose for some sugar. Trees, reeds, catfish, and whales, these are other organisms that we find fossilized. Well, what happens if you leave a fish set out? Yeah, he's going to rot. So he's going to get scavenged. There's not going to be a whole lot of him left. Well, what about a massive whale? And we see beached whales, what happens? Animals get after them, they rot. But we've been able to find fossils of these creatures. In fact, they've been able to find a fully preserved whale skeleton, and it still had the baleen in its teeth. You know what baleen is? It's that real thin material that whale uses to filter out the tiny organisms in the water. You know what would happen if that was left to sit out for millions and billions of years? It'd be gone. It'd be history. How is it that it's perfectly preserved in this fossil? Had to have been done quickly. So which model is this consistent with? Polystrate fossil. Creation or evolution? Creation, absolutely. Well, when we get back from the break, we're going to look at similarity. And we're going to see, is that evidence for creation or for evolution? Thank you.
say you believe, I think you're a lack of, how did you fall for that? Yeah. Especially on the oh yeah, if you don't go. In Chicago they have a field museum. And huge dinosaur. You rent the plaque out in the corner, there's only 4 bones, and they imagine the rest of it. They were forced to remove it because it was all just made up. They were forced to do it. They were sued and they had to get rid of it. And they said, what is the biggest dinosaur we've had? T-Rex, which is only like 10 or 12 feet tall. They said, that's the biggest one they actually have. The whole thing. They said, you think of a herd of 1,000 buffalo. It's rumbling so hard, the ground is shaking, you only can see it. Man killed all of them. All of them. There's not a huge herd of thousands of these things with spears. No guys with spears. Eliminated them. You think that a couple dinosaurs we could have killed off? Come on now. Well, you know. Yeah. No.
Javion's having a good time. Have they been to VBS before? All right, I think it's about time to get started. How many cookies did you guys eat? Not enough? You didn't bring any up?
I did already.
You didn't want to be the teacher's pet, did you? You want to be, you got a Cool Whip container full of them. I know who I'm talking to after this. All right. Well, this is the final point we're going to look at before we go to the fun part. We get to ask you questions. So let's look at similarity. Is this evidence for creation or evolution? Now sometimes, and we've probably experienced this, you see somebody that has an identical twin. We look at them, they look almost exactly the same, or perhaps they are exactly the same as far as how they look. And it's easy to tell if they are related because they look alike. We see that sometimes mothers and daughters look alike, fathers and sons, cousins, and so many times these things that look alike, we say, are related to one another. And from a genetic standpoint, oftentimes, if you have two black rabbits, they'll give birth to black rabbits, other things like that. I have to share with you a story. We have a Presidents of the United States book. My son, Sam, he's in lower level there, saw William Bill Clinton, our 42nd president. You remember him? And he goes, "Mr. Jack!" Well, I'm not sure Jack likes the similarities there. But what was he doing? He's 3 years old. What is he doing? He sees the silver hair of Bill Clinton, and he associates that with the silver hair of Jack, and that's where it stops. That's where the similarity stops. But we see that. It's an illustration of that. Well, evolution gloms onto that as well, and they say, well, if two things look like each other, aha, they have to be common ancestors. The concept that similarity often shows relationship is one of the most impressive arguments for the theory of evolution. Scientists that have worked in various fields, they've learned that basic similarities exist between different groups or certain groups. They call these similarities homologous structures. That's just a fancy word for similar. Now, the wing of the bat, the forefoot of a turtle, the forefoot of a frog, the arm of a man, they have similar general structures. You see it. Here's that of a bat. If we could imagine a human arm with very long fingers, we could probably make that association there. Also, they note that the forefoot of a dog, the flipper of a whale, the hand of a man contain essentially the same bones and muscle tissue. So, guess what they conclude? Aha, they're similar. Well, how do we respond to that? How would creationists respond to that type of an argument? Here's one thing we must never do. Do not deny the facts that these things are the case. Yes, they are similar. But does that show common ancestry or something else? And this is a wonderful lesson. It is rarely the facts that are in dispute. It is the interpretation of the facts. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 16 and verse 25, and I had to get this passage in. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. So when we look at similarities, how do we respond to it? Instead of claiming common ancestry, we say that evidence actually points to a common designer. Now let me illustrate this. GMC. How many of you drive a GMC? Yeah, we think about automobiles. They have the same wheels, the same body shapes, the same brake systems. Why is that? Why do those cars have those same type of systems? Because the same company, the same designers designed them. When you think about it, when God created a lung, He designed a brain, He designed a nervous system that worked well, would it not make sense that He would use these similar type features in different animals that live in the same type of environment, that perhaps breathe the same air, eat the same food? Well, similarity doesn't always show common ancestry. In fact, many times it actually shows common design. But when we look at all the similarities, Obviously, they don't show common ancestry, and I'll illustrate this. The octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog, oh, isn't he cute? His face, the donkey's milk, they have similar parallel structures in the human body. But even evolutionists would deny that the living animals that these things are found in are closely related to one another. If we did evolve from similar creatures, think about this. Why can't we receive organ transplants from them or blood transfusion? You know, there is a shortage of blood in this area. I recently gave blood at work. I think they were 2,000 units of blood down. Why can't we just go to an animal and extract their blood and use it for humans? Doesn't work, does it? Why can't we take a heart? Somebody's dying, needs a heart transplant. Why can't we go talk to our cousin the ape? Say, hey fella, I need your heart because a person's more important than you are. Why don't we do that? It doesn't work. It would be rejected by the body. I'm not trying to be crass in this last question, but you have to think about it. If we are common ancestors, why can't we reproduce with them? Why is that biologically impossible? There's a reason. God made us different. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him, male and female created He them. You catch in 27, one of those phrases is repeated twice. There's emphasis provided there. In whose image were we made? God. What other of God's creations can say that? Not one of them. We have an eternal spirit. They do not. Something else interesting, do you notice? God is speaking in verse 26. What's the pronoun He uses? Us. Here's a wonderful proof very early on of the Trinity, we sometimes say, the Godhead. Right there. I'll throw that one in for some extra credit. Now there was also not a suitable mate for Adam prior to woman being created. You remember Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18, and the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him." Adam, all those animals come forward. God brings them before him. He gives them names. Verse 20. And Adam gave names to all cattle and to the fowl of the air and to every beast of the field. And Adam married a pig. Is that what happened? Absolutely not. It says, "But for Adam there was not found an help meet for him." The animals weren't going to work. And we know the rest of the story. And I think this passage, more than maybe that one, shows the proof that we are different. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 39, "All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds." What is that passage teaching? We're different, aren't we? I bet this fish right here wished he was the same flesh as this bird, so he'd leave him alone. But they're different. We are different. They're not the same. They're not compatible with one another because God created them differently. Remember, after their kind. We might look similar, but that is only because we have a common, magnificent Creator. All right, it's time for the fun part. Some discussion questions. What are several differences between creation and evolution? Who can give me one of them? Say again? Time. Absolutely, time. What does creation say? 6 days. That's what our children downstairs, that's what they're learning, isn't it? God made everything in 6 24-hour days. We're going to look at that on Thursday. Because there are going to be some that try and fit evolution and creation together. Theistic evolution. Time is one of them. What's another one? Cause and effect? Absolutely. Evolution says what? Single-celled organism from something non-living. And from thence we get everything we know. What's another one? How about this one? God versus only nature. Evolution does what with God? Doesn't exist. Nothing outside of nature. And then, as Kima says, creation teaches we got something from something. A great cause from which we get the effect. Evolution says we got something from nothing. You go try that. Like, I don't have anything. See if you get anything from nothing. Not going to happen. And then time, of course. Why do many people clash over which one should be taught? This is an interesting question, isn't it? Why do so many people get into arguments about this? What do you think? Why are there so many believers in evolution? Money. There you go. Think there's money involved with it? How about this one? If God does exist, then guess what? He wrote a book, and in that book, He requires what of mankind? Accountability. And you know what? Whether you believe it or not, God wrote a book, and every man is going to be held accountable for what he does in his body, as we looked at last night, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. How many people want to believe God? Not very many. They don't want to be held accountable. But I think some of those other reasons fit in there as well. People want to do what people want to do. That's what we face in the church, isn't it? Why don't we have more people here tonight? People want to do what people want to do. Psalm 53 and verse 3, you can look that one up in your Bibles later on. Well, Dr. Louis Pasteur did experiments that disproved what false theory? Remember with the flasks, what did he disprove? Starts with an S. Yeah, spontaneous generation, that you get something from nothing. And people believe this. They believed you could do that. Now, can you see why people might have held to that theory in the past? You think some actually believed if you left something on the counter, it would grow plants or vegetation or other things. And they didn't fully understand the idea of bacteria, that things were airborne. They didn't really understand how life worked. And we think about it. We go back enough time, science advances over time, doesn't it? It changes. We learn new things. In fact, what does the word science mean? The simple word for it. It comes from the Greek word gnosis, knowledge. Science is knowledge. But there is such a thing as false knowledge, false science. When you think about knowledge, we think about the Bible. We think about the truth in knowledge. And the true science fits so well with the Bible. I was talking in the break there that there are scientists that have said, well, let's stop rejecting what the Bible has to say and let's follow it, and we'll see if the science lines up. And you know what they're finding out? It lines up, and they're becoming good scientists. They're like, this is a great roadmap for understanding things because it's the truth. Well, science was still and will continue to be developing, and that's an important point as well. Well, how does that theory relate to evolution? That is, spontaneous generation. What does evolution purport? Time, single-celled organism, something from nothing. Spontaneous generation. Well, in order for evolution to be established, what must be, underline that word, must be found in the fossil record. Transitional forms, that's right. And not just some. To get from a single-celled organism, remember how many cells there are in just one human body? You think about the millions, the billions of these things. To get to that point, to where we are now, you've got to have a lot of transitional forms. Now, what would you expect to find in the fossil record if creation is true? Fully functional, complete, complex things, forms. So what is it that scientists actually find in the fossil record? Millions of complete forms. That's pretty telling evidence, isn't it? Similarities can show two things. What are they? Common design. What's the other one? Well, that would be common design. Ancestry. Remember, ancestry and design. And we don't deny, again, from a family standpoint, we can sometimes start to look like our family. I've been told sometimes those that are pet owners start to look like their pets. I don't know. I used to have a schnauzer, and they're known for their beards. Well, maybe. How does the creationist answer the idea that similarities show common ancestry? How do we answer that? Now, I just had this point. You're not in the sugar coma yet, are you? I have to revive you. Well, we show examples with similarity that absolutely cannot have common ancestry. Remember, you have the octopus eye, the Pekingese dog's face, the pig heart. They're not related to one another in the sense that they're a common ancestor. They're very different creatures. We set forth the idea that similarity actually shows common design. And you can see that again with the car company. You can see it in other things. Again, I work for a company that manufactures transformers and other things. You know what the first thing we do when we have a part come in? We look for a similar type design. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We already have something that we know that works. This is pretty close. Maybe we just need to tweak the number of turns and a magnetic winding or this or that. We use those same principles today. Now, what is the one thing that we should not do when answering such arguments? Deny the facts. Don't deny the facts. Don't deny the data that you see. Now, again, people can tamper with things, so use your brain, use reason, and logic. But if it is a fact, you don't deny it. It's how that is interpreted. But why does it matter what you believe about creation and evolution? And this kind of gets to the heart of our study. Why does it even matter that somebody believes in evolution versus creation? Why is it important? That's right. That's exactly right. It changes your thought process about every single thing that you see, that you interact with, that you dream about, all of these things. It determines your views on how to live life. Why are so many evolutionists atheists? Why is it? Evolution rejects God. Remember, it's all natural. Creator doesn't fit in. He's supernatural. Evolution rejects that concept. So very often you find that evolutionists and atheists are one and the same. In fact, Darwin, you know what he was? He wasn't an atheist. He wasn't a believer either. He was a skeptic. Why do you think some people prefer to believe in evolution? Yeah. They don't want to answer to somebody else. In fact, oftentimes they think, man, he's it. That's humanism. In fact, you'll look at evolution, you'll find humanists too. They don't want to follow the ways of God. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 22. So let's conclude. Here are the facts. Facts of science say that a material effect requires an adequate cause which comes before the effect. Well, what have evolutionists set forth that meet all of this criteria? Nothing. They don't have anything. The facts of science say that in nature, life comes only from previously existing life. What does evolution say? Life came from non-living something. The facts show that no transitional forms of half and half organisms exist in the fossil record. What does evolution maintain? There has to be. There's got to be. The fossil record's wrong. It's imperfect. It's not there. The facts show that similarities sometimes show common ancestry, but also can show common design. We might say even more often. Now, here's something about facts. They're stubborn. They're impartial. They refuse to budge for people of high estate or low degree. They don't care who you are. Facts are facts. Concepts of creation and evolution stand on opposite sides. And guess who has the facts standing on their side? We do, as creationists. All the evidence points to an intelligent designer. Now, tomorrow night, we're going to be spending some time, really the whole time, looking at evolutionary hoaxes. So there's various things that evolution has set forth that says, aha, we found the missing link. We got it. This is it. Evolution's true. We're going to find out in a lot of cases they've been disproven. They're not true. And we're going to look at just exactly what a hoax is, who would be behind a hoax, and we'll examine all of these various proofs. Any thoughts, comments, or questions?